Hey everyone, thanks for joining me in session 138. Got a great interview to share with you today. It's actually a two-part interview taped at two different times. Shortly after I published an episode on Police Academy training with John O'Neill a few months ago, Tina Long, who's a BCBA from Northern Virginia, emailed me to share the outreach work she has done with her local police department in Fairfax County. Specifically in the wake of the nationwide re-examination of the role of policing, Tina felt compelled to share what she learned about the ACT matrix with local law enforcement personnel. And after learning more about her story, I thought this was definitely worth sharing on the podcast. So Tina and I had a brief conversation that we recorded back in August. At the time, she had the opportunity to do a training with the police department, but unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond her control, her allotted time was cut down to 20 minutes. I can only imagine the horror of trying to truncate a long workshop into just about 20 minutes. So, as such, we made plans to connect later on and record another segment once Tina was able to get deeper into the material. So this podcast consists of both the original conversation from last August and our follow-up, which was just recorded recently in November of 2020. For part two of this conversation, Tina was able to get Officer Joe Schlenz from the Fairfax County Police Department to join us as well. In this segment, Joe provided a wide-ranging perspective on the role of empathy and compassion in policing, de-escalation, both in terms of working with fellow officers as well as individuals in the community, triaging and managing risk for unsafe situations, officer burnout, officer suicide, and so much more. I think you'll really find his contribution to the show very compelling. So if you're concerned about policing in America, I really hope the work that he and his colleagues are doing will give you a sense of optimism. And as I've said in previous shows, it's always great to talk about how people from different fields consume and apply concepts from the behavioral sciences. I think this is really the first podcast where we talk about the ACT matrix in particular. If you're a longtime listener, we've done many shows on ACT itself, but I'm looking forward to learning more about the ACT matrix as well. So you can probably expect to hear more about that in 2021. But for the time being, this is, I think, a good primer as well as a good opportunity to see how an everyday behavior analyst reached out to her local police department just trying to make a difference. I think just that alone is a great story and a great example, too. So, again, thank you, Tina, for reaching out to me. Before we get to the interview, though, this podcast is brought with you with generous support from the following. HRIC Recruiting. Barb Voss has been placing BCBAs in permanent positions throughout the United States for just about a decade and has been in the business more generally for 30 years. So when you work with HRIC, you work directly with Barb. Thereby, you access a highly professional, highly personalized service. So if you're about to graduate, or if you're looking for a change of pace, or if you just want to know if the grass really is greener on the other side, head over to hricolorado.com to schedule a confidential chat with Barb right away. Again, that's hricolorado.com. We're also brought to you by the Whoop Strap. I've been wearing the Whoop Strap for, it's got to be over a month now, close to 2. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed getting all these data, on all aspects of my health, including sleep analytics, heart rate variability, calorie burn. Whoop has a lot of cool kind of proprietary metrics like strain and recovery. I can go on and on about the virtues of this little device. But if you want to learn more about it, I would just recommend that you go to behavioralobservations.com/whoop. And if you go there and you sign up to get it, you'll get the first month free. Lastly, we are brought to you from CEUs from Behavioral Observations. That's right, yours truly. Or more specifically, podcast guests such as Greg Hanley, Steve Hayes, Mark Dixon, Megan Miller, Pat Fryman, and much, much more share their expertise on a variety of topics. And we're able to provide CEUs as a result of that. So to hear more about what we have for offerings, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs, or just click the Get CEUs tab at the top of the homepage. You can see all of, again, what we have available, as well as some really steep discounts for multiple event purchases. So I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further ado, please enjoy this episode with Tina and Joe.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Tina Long, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is all mine. You reached out to me a few weeks ago, and we'll save the circumstance under which that happened for a minute. And you had this really kind of unique topic to talk about, and so I'm so glad you did, and I can't wait to get into it. But before we do that, though, I want you to have the opportunity to tell the audience how you got into behavior analysis, and in doing so, kind of bring us up to speed to kind of what you're doing now and how it relates to what we're going to talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah, so my first exposure to ABA was as an undergrad. I was at George Mason University in Fairfax, and I had to do an experiential learning. I always wanted to be a teacher. Like, I would line up my stuffed animals and I would recruit students or, my peers in daycare to be students. And I would get my daycare teachers to photocopy worksheets. And I just wanted to be a teacher. No, really. And then they would be my students and I would hand out worksheets. And so I just always wanted to be a teacher. So I was in an education program, a little integrative studies thing, and we had to do experiential learnings. And I had been substitute teaching. And so I got a job as an instructional assistant in Fairfax County as an ABA instructional assistant. And Fairfax County puts on a really cool 2-week hands-on intensive ABA training for instructional assistants and teachers who are in the ABA program. And so I got to participate in that. And they were actually flying out Ron Leaf and John McCacken. And I think Ron Leaf observed me one time in a classroom as an IA. And that didn't quite work out because the cooperating teacher refused to use ABA. It was kind of not a pleasant experience. So I went back to substitute teaching because I just wanted to be a teacher. I wasn't interested in ABA or really autism or anything like that. So I got a provisional license and was a middle school teacher in Virginia. If you have one special education course beyond your bachelor's degree, which I had 5 because I did a minor, you can teach. And so somebody gave me a teaching license. And I was a team teacher for middle school math and science. And I failed. I was horrible at it. And really it's because I didn't understand behavior. I left. I didn't even finish out the year because it was such a bad experience and I was such a failure. I went to a private tutoring center. That was a failed. Go ahead.
What made you come to that conclusion? Was it you just had a lot of challenging behaviors in the classroom and you weren't able to?
That's what it was. Yeah. So one day, a student pushed me out of the classroom. He wanted to leave the classroom and I was standing by the doorway and I was like, well, you can't leave. You have to stay here. And he just pushed me out of the classroom. And the response to that was to move him to a different class. And to avoid him getting in more trouble and to avoid any kind of further. And the year that I was at this particular middle school, there were over 500 behavioral referrals. Mm-hmm. And there was no system for how to interact with students who had challenging behaviors. And I was not prepared. I was fresh out of my 4 or 5 years of undergrad. I didn't do student teaching because you don't have to do that when you get a provisional license. And the cooperating teachers that I had were not supportive and they were not interested in really accommodating students with disabilities. They were the general education teachers who were just there to deliver the science and math. And it was my job to reach the other students. And I was not prepared at all.
Oh my gosh.
I didn't understand students don't do their homework. That was foreign to me. What do you mean you don't do your homework? Students don't stay in their chairs. And so the school response was always just to shuffle students around and not really address any of the rules that weren't being enforced or changing the rules when they're not working. So it was real bad. And I thought, well, I guess I won't ever be a teacher again because that didn't work. So I went.
So is a provisional license what we might call an Alt-4 or something like, some sort of alternative route to teaching?
Yeah. So it's a 3-year non-renewable and you have 3 years to finish the rest of your courses.
I see.
For a teaching license. And in Virginia, we don't have to have a master's degree in teaching, but we do have to have, I think it's 30 some credits for a teaching license.
Okay.
And so instead of doing student teaching, those 3 years that you're under the provisional license count as your student teaching. But I had a teaching job. Like it was a teaching job that I probably should not have had. I was not prepared at all.
Right. So it's like kind of being quote unquote in flight school, yet you're, flying a plane.
Oh, yeah. Building it while flying it at the same time.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. I'm sorry.
And writing IEPs and leading classes or, leading meetings and things like that I just was not prepared for at all.
Yeah. And so it doesn't sound like there's any kind of like positive behavioral intervention supports or RTI or MTSS or any of those kind of large scale interventions.
No. And at that time, those weren't even being discussed in school. And even though Fairfax County had a pretty robust ABA program, it wasn't being utilized outside of really classes that had students with autism.
I see.
So yeah, that was just kind of the beginning of when the program was built in Fairfax County. So they weren't using it at all.
All right. So you realized, at least given those circumstances, that teaching in that environment was not for you.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't have the skills for it.
Sounds like a difficult place to succeed in, regardless of one's skill set. But so why don't you pick it up from there? I interrupted you.
Yeah, that's okay. So I went to a private tutoring center, and that was a failed business model. Like the business wasn't surviving. So I went to an early Head Start and was, a program director or something for early Head Start, where clinicians would go into homes, like family homes, that were identified basically based on income, and go through ages and stages questionnaires and provide education on milestones and nutrition and things like that. And I didn't love that. It wasn't really what I wanted to do. So I did a Craigslist search for some part-time jobs, and the ABA came up, this in-home ABA with an agency. And I remembered how much I did love the ABA part of being an instructional assistant, even though the classroom experience wasn't awesome. Mm-hmm. I really loved the individualization of it and the database decision-making, the positive reinforcement piece of it. And it felt like a way to teach that was personal, but also systematic. And I'm a very systematic person, and I like protocols. So I applied, got a job full-time in-home ABA, very traditional. It was still, in-home ABA agencies were still new to at least our area. And again, this agency actually was consulting with the guys in California. Mm-hmm. And I loved it so much. And I said, okay, if after a year I still have this passion that I do for it, then I'll apply to grad school and pursue a BCBA. And so that's what I did. And I did a few different agencies so that I could get a few different experiences. The first one was very traditional. One of them was, we were all kind of free to do what we wanted. There weren't a lot of BCBAs supervising us. And so it was a lot more flexible, but also a lot more like fly your own plane. Yeah. Than the very strict in-home ABA one that I was in. And then I had the opportunity to apply to be a behavior specialist in a small school system inside of Fairfax County, which is a separate school system, but still in Fairfax County. So I did that for a few years, and I loved working in schools again. And that's where I started to integrate more kind of contextual fit flexibility and what I was doing, because schools, as you know, are not as controlled as home environments. Home environments also aren't as controlled, aren't a strictly controlled place. But I got into schools. And then after I had my second child, I left the schools and just went back to doing full-time consultation. Mm-hmm. And so now I work under our state waiver, doing therapeutic consultation for individuals with disabilities, intellectual and developmental, and then a number of mental health diagnoses that come along with it.
Very cool. So it sounds like after a number of experiences, you kind of found some kind of place of equilibrium that works for you right now.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm loving all of the flexibility that I've got with consulting. I don't do the traditional in-home ABA that a lot of behavior analysts, at least in our area, do. I consult with families, caregivers, other service providers, and have a couple of consultants who work with me as well.
As I kind of teased earlier, so you reached out to me and you're doing you said you had a training scheduled with your local PD, your police department, or county sheriffs. I can't remember exactly what it was, but you can fill in all the details here. So tell me about that and what made you want to kind of reach out and kind of talk about it here on the podcast.
Yeah. So when COVID happened and everything shut down, I found myself with more time because I was actually sitting in one place. I wasn't traveling from program to group home to school and I actually set up an office, which I didn't have before because after 2 babies, I had to give up my office. And so I was just very transient and working from the car and didn't have time to focus on different projects, just my clients. And I started to attend some free ACT webinars that were being offered by other behavior analysts and learned about Kevin Polk and Phil Tonellia, who were offering ACT Matrix training. And so I signed up for that. I knew that if I paid somebody money that I would be accountable to it and actually go through the training. And I really enjoyed it. And then when the George Floyd killing happened, I just felt drawn to do something to help in our community. I was recently having a conversation with a fellow business owner. He's in the bar industry. He's not in disabilities world at all. But he said, I believe that you don't build businesses, you build community, and then the business comes. And so I just really felt drawn to do something and figure out how to finally take this work that I knew was so important and do something in my community to help. And so I was talking to Phil and Kevin about it. And about a week later, I said, hey guys, we've got this thing called the Matrix. We do this pro-social matrix where we talk about a shared purpose. And certainly we have to have a shared purpose as a community of law enforcement and community members. And I'd assume it'd be safety, but let's see what they say. And so Kevin and Phil happened to have another behavior analyst who lives 20 minutes from me doing the training as well. And so she emailed me and said, hey, Kevin and Phil mentioned that you want to maybe talk to local law enforcement and see if there's anything that we can do with the Matrix to bring a shared purpose and talk about how we initially approached it as how to de-escalate unarmed individuals. Because I work with a lot of adults with disabilities who they call the police themselves. I don't know if you've had any experience.
Yes, I've had.
Yes, because the police always come. They always come. They provide lots of attention. They can de-escalate a situation. And we in Fairfax County have the crisis intervention team, which is a team of specially trained officers who they have just more training and a class in individuals with mental health and developmental and intellectual disabilities. So Elena said, I heard you wanted to do this too. Let's do it. And that's where we started, was just with an email that Phil and Kevin hooked us up on.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from various ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process, and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, there are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you're ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed. Very nice. So I want to get to the actual training itself. and I'm very I'm very curious to learn about the content of it and the reactions and whatnot. But before doing that, I think it makes some sense to talk about what the ACT matrix is. Now, listeners to the show will, probably know that we've done a gazillion episodes on just ACT itself. So I think you could probably assume that there's some base level knowledge of, some of the ACT processes like, diffusion, acceptance, et cetera.
Yeah.
But feel free to define those as you see fit as well. But let's kind of walk through the ACT matrix first, so we can all get everyone on the same page. And so let's do that, and then we can kind of get into what your training consisted of.
So the ACT matrix, you can Google it and find many diagrams of it. I've also created some and thrown them up on my website with the prompts that we go around. But it's picture in your head. I know we're face to face, but anybody listening, picture in your head. It's 2 lines, a vertical and a horizontal on a piece of paper. And so it creates 4 quadrants. And we just go through a series of questions. And so you can do this with me, or I'll fill in the blanks. But the very first question is, who's important to you? And you get, would you like to respond, or do you want me to?
Just tell me how people typically respond.
Okay. So who's important to you? And you usually get answers like my family, my friends, my coworkers, things like that. Cool. So we write those down, whatever is said. And then we move to the bottom left and we say, is there any hard stuff that comes up throughout your day? Do you have any uncomfortable things, frustrating, anger, anything like that? How about pandemics? That's been my first response to everything.
Sure.
Pandemics. That's been a hard thing that's come up and gotten in the way of doing what's important to me or seeing who's important to me. So we list out all of those things. Whatever is said, you write it down. It's very non-judgmental. Just write down what people say. And then we move to the top left and we say, what are some of the behaviors that I could see you engaging in? Or what are some of the behaviors that humans in general engage in to move away from the hard stuff? When hard things like stress and anger and frustration come up, or pandemics, what are things that you do or that humans do in general? Well, we complain, we yell, we avoid it, we scroll social media. So we list out all of those observable behaviors that people engage in to move away from the hard stuff. And then we go to the top right and we say, what are the things that you do, or what are the things that you could do to get closer to who or what's important to you? And this is where people say things like, well, I could call them, or we could do Zoom happy hours since we can't meet in person right now. Mm-hmm. I have been really, really purposeful about putting down my phone so that when I'm spending time with my children, it's not distracted, things like that.
The struggle's real.
Yep. So those are the 4 quadrants. And so we do that one time. And then we ask, do you think as you're going about your day or your weeks, you might have the opportunity to notice when hard stuff comes up? Might you have the opportunity to notice what you're doing to move away from the hard stuff, or what you could do to move towards who and what's important to you? And then we talk about workability. So is that working? Are the things that you're doing working to get closer to who or what you say is important to you? And since this is for behavior analysts, or people who want to be behavior analysts, I'll say the ACT matrix is designed to teach 2 discriminations. Number 1, the difference between things that are going on in the physical world, 5 senses experiences, what an ACT process would be as present moment awareness, and the things that are going on in our private events and the things that can't be seen. So the difference between internal and external experiences, and then the things that we do to move away from the uncomfortable stuff and towards who and what's important to us. And that's a first loop around the matrix. And I could map out all of the processes on that, that the who and what's important, that's the values piece of ACT. The hard stuff, that's the diffusion, because when you write it down, when you put it out there, you're literally creating space between the uncomfortable stuff and you. And then there's acceptance. And when you're identifying the behaviors that you're doing to move away from the uncomfortable stuff, you're practicing some acceptance. And then what could you do to get closer to who or what's important to you? That's the committed action piece.
I see. So again, this would be something that would be, we're trying to describe a visual process here,
it's a diagram,
audio medium, but first of all, I think we could probably find some sort of graphic that we can share in the show notes for today's episode. So that's, I think, one, I guess, point number one. And two, it sounds like, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm understanding you correctly, that the matrix is a way for folks to kind of dig into some of these ACT processes a little bit more directly, or it maybe offers a faster route or a shortcut. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but a shortcut to some of this stuff that would typically be done. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and so it's an application that sets up a process that gets us into that ACT work without me having to tell anybody about diffusion or self as context, which is that bottom piece when you're, if you can see it, when you're recognizing that you are not your thoughts and feelings and urges and sensations, you are who hears them, or you are who experiences them. But I don't have to explain that to people when I bring them into this process to help them sort out their experiences.
Hey everyone, just in case you missed it at the top of the show, this episode is brought to you by the Whoop Strap. The Whoop Strap is this fun little device. It's kind of like a smartwatch, but it doesn't tell time. It's actually very unobtrusive. I don't like to I haven't worn a watch in, 15 years or so. I don't like things like on me or anything like that. I don't really wear much in the way of jewelry or anything like that. So it's just a very slim little band that just goes around your wrist, and it tracks all sorts of cool things like your heart rate, how well you sleep, and things like that. Calorie burn, and so if you're looking to get a clearer picture of your health, this is a great little device to check out. I've got so much more to say on it, but I think I'd rather just point you to the website where you can learn more about it. So you can head over to behavioralobservations.com/whoop. That'll take you right over to my friends at the Whoop Strap. And if you sign up through that link, you'll get the first month free. So I hope you get a chance to check it out if this is something that you think would help you. All right, let's get back to this conversation with Tina. One of the things I'm interested in is, how these things come about. So I want to I know you kind of talked about it a minute ago, but I want to take a few steps back, and I just want to you to go through like the anatomy of how you approach the police department, and certainly I want to get into the training as well. So, if you can just kind of like let us know, because where I'm going with this is that it would be great to kind of use this as a model for other behavior analysts who might be similarly interested in trying to help out in their own communities and and so on. So why don't you start from there, please?
Yeah. So I said to Kevin and Phil, do you think this is a viable idea? And they said, yes, do it. And what's great about them is they just say yes, do it to everything. So Elena emailed me and we set up a Zoom chat. And we both said, yep, let's do it. So we started, I found a name of, somebody in the commission in Fairfax County who looked like they would be who might help us. So we emailed him, we called him. We didn't get a response. We regrouped the next week. I reached out to my pastor, and she said, I could get you in touch with the crisis intervention team trainer at this department. And I said, okay, sounds good. And then we figured out that the National Alliance for Mental Illness is who teams up with Fairfax County Police Department for a couple of the pieces of this week-long training. So we found maybe the regional director's name, our Northern Virginia person, emailed her and said, hey, we'd like to present this process that we think could help to start a conversation with the community and law enforcement. Would you be interested? She said yes. We set up a Zoom chat. And the thing about the ACT Matrix is it's not something that you tell people about, really. You just show them. And so I plugged up my iPad and shared the screen, and we did the Matrix with her. We did one loop around individually, and then we took her around a second time to talk about the shared purpose of the three of us coming together to talk about, community conversations around law enforcement and de-escalation. And she said, this is cool. So she called the lead instructor for the CIT team at Fairfax County Police Department. And she called me back maybe 2 hours later and said, hey, can you get on a Zoom chat and show this guy this thing? And I said, sure. So we hopped on a Zoom chat. I showed it to the officer. He said, this is great. Can you come on this date this time? So we just did it. And he actually, once we went through it, he was really into it. And he said, this looks like it sets up for situational awareness. And we said, yeah. And again, present moment awareness isn't a word that I throw out when I'm working. I'm not saying, and now we're going to work on present moment awareness or let's do this exercise. But he derived it up himself. And he said, and in law enforcement, we call that tactical awareness. And, they need to see this. And we were like, cool. So he scheduled us. We went. They actually did it at George Mason University in one of the big auditoriums because they needed to be distanced. And so we were like every 5 or 6 seats in an auditorium. And then we had to speak with masks on, which was difficult. We were on stage with a microphone with a mask on. They wouldn't let us do the clear shields or anything. And we had our whiteboard and we drew the matrix and we went around it twice.
So what, I'm fascinated to hear how this went because I guess firstly I'll say that I'm pleasantly surprised to hear that at least the law enforcement contact that you did make sounded really into it and kind of grasped it. And I guess maybe I have some stereotype of some sort of macho based rejection of something that's touchy feely in this regard. Was that something that you were wondering if you're going to see some of that? And did you see that amongst perhaps some individual participants?
No. So because the ACT Matrix is a process that you show, you just jump into it. And what I have found, like every single time that I do it, is that people respond to the questions. When you ask somebody who's important to you, I suppose that's touchy-feely, but we all have somebody who's important to us. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you start with a question like, what are your values? That seems touchy-feely, and that could seem a little bit more like, I don't know how to get...
How do you want to be remembered?
Right, yeah. Which is important, and those are important conversations to have. But asking who's important to you, every once in a while, I'll get a teenager who's like, nobody. And then I'll say, right. Oh, well, what about yourself? Yeah, okay, I'm important to myself. Cool. And we write that down. So I haven't experienced people being resistant to it because it's not accessible in that way. And they all answered like a lot. There were a lot of responses to all of the questions.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that. Were there responses that surprised you, and were there responses that kind of led themselves? Well, I guess another way of saying this is that were there specific repertoires you wanted these policemen and policewomen to walk away with? And if so, what was it? And in doing so, can you kind of talk about some of the range of responses that to the various questions that you asked?
Yeah. So as far as kind of what we wanted to share and the skills that we wanted to build, initially it's just about those noticing skills. So can you notice and name things as they come up? So can you notice and name who's important to you? Can you notice and name what are the hard things? Can you notice and name what are the things that you do when hard stuff comes up? And can you notice and name things that you could do to get closer to who or what's important to you? And then the workability piece, can you look at, is that working to get you, or if we're talking about a shared purpose, is that working to get us closer to our shared purpose? So noticing and workability were kind of the two skills and we didn't have a ton of time. We thought we would have more time, and then our time kind of got cut short. So it was quick, but it's a process. So what we're really hoping is that we are invited back to the September class. They do a new class. I don't know how often, but we're hoping that we can kind of open more avenues of conversations. As far as the responses to the questions, after doing this so many times, I found that there's a number of typical responses. When you ask people who's important to them, it's things like my family, my coworkers, my pets, my friends, neighbors, colleagues, those, people tend to have similar important people. When ask about hard stuff, fear, all humans have experienced fear at some point in their lives. Anger, not enough time, being tired, pandemics, common answers. And then what are the things that we do to move away from it? There are a lot of common answers. Eat junk food, people exercise, do yoga, deep breathing, meditation, complain, meet with friends, things like that. Where sometimes people get stuck is with the what could you do or what do you do? And that's okay. We're just trying to derive up some new responses. And then when we talked about the shared purpose, safety was a big one for, I think, the community and for law enforcement. Safety and collaboration, connection, things like that. And then the hard stuff. I think somebody could, so this annoying thing happens when I get up for public speaking. I'm never nervous before it happens. And then when I start talking, my voice starts to shake a lot and it eventually stops. And I don't know why it happens. A long time ago, I would just run. I would run away from that. I don't do that anymore, but it was happening. And especially with the mask on, it's really uncomfortable.
It has to be so annoying.
So I had to take a beat and say, I need to take a breath. And I took my mask off and I turned around and I took a breath. And somebody shouted out, a hard thing, public speaking. And I think they were feeling some discomfort with what looked uncomfortable to me, even though I was moving through it just fine. I knew it would pass. And then the things that we do to move away from it, we avoid having hard conversations. We quit our jobs. We blame other people. We make excuses, things like that. Schedule more trainings that aren't really effective. So everybody participated a lot, and we could have had a much longer conversation about it if we weren't limited on time. And I think that was surprising. I expected some responses, but I didn't expect the level of participation that we had. So that was really nice.
How much time did you end up having with them?
Like maybe 20 minutes.
Oh, wow.
It was not a lot at all.
I see.
Yeah.
Then what do you, where do you think this could go? Meaning that, obviously 20 minutes is sounds like as you said, you got kind of, you got cut short considerably, and I don't know how much you originally planned for, but obviously that's a tough time to teach. It's a very short period of time to teach just about anything, let alone something as important as this stuff. But so I think perhaps one of the things where I'm curious is like where can this go, especially as it relates to some of that, to use the law enforcement term, that tactical awareness. How do you think if you had more time and if these officers had more practice, what's the potential for learning more about this as it relates to those, arriving on a scene where things are tense, potentially dangerous, things like that? What's the practical application of these skills?
Yeah. So what we had hoped to do, and we thought we would have closer to an hour. I had printed diagrams. We wanted the officers to practice together. We found out when we got there that they weren't passing anything out and they wouldn't be interacting, which was okay because we ended up not having enough time. But we would have had them go through and pair up and practice doing the matrix together and asking each other questions. As far as practical applications, when any of us are faced with any kind of really stressful situation, escalations, things like that, it can be easy to start responding to our own private events and all of the relations that we're deriving up and things like that, as opposed to staying in the present moment and remembering why we're there, what we're there for. Is it to be safe? Is it to get this person off the street? Is it to help this person reintegrate into their group home? Things like that. And so practical applications of it, the hope is that community members and law enforcement can work around a shared purpose and practice our mindfulness and present moment awareness and respond to the events that are actually occurring in front of us, instead of all of the private events that we're relating to and all of the fears or the excitement or the agitation or the stress or the exhaustion that's coming up, and recognize that what we're responding to is out here, or are we responding to some private events? And the officer who watched us go through this the first time, who leads the class, he connected with that right away. But he also has lots of additional training in some of these practices because he leads this crisis intervention team. So the cool thing about the ACT Matrix is that since it's a process, we can always come back to it. It's not just a thing that you do and then leave.
Right.
You put it up, you get out of the way, you let people work through it and come back to it often.
I see. And so I think the good news out of this is I'm happy to hear that you got invited back. So that's definitely cool. So are you going to be working with is it that you're going to be working with a new set of trainees?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So they do these classes. I heard that the chief was at the one in August. So what we're hoping is that we can start to maybe open up some community conversations as well, because it would be really great to bring community members together with law enforcement, even if it's just the CIT class to begin with, or, the CIT group of officers, and have a shared purpose conversation about here we are as a community. What's our shared purpose? Why are we all here? What's the hard stuff that comes up and gets in the way when we're trying to work towards that shared purpose? What are the things that we do to get away from it? And what could we do to be a community and work towards this shared purpose?
Yeah. And when you mean shared purpose, I'm assuming this like kind of shared values, shared common interests that go along with that too, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Shared values, shared common interests. We all come together. And usually I'll just say, I'll say, what's our shared purpose? Why did you all come here? What are we here for? And so when I do like my free webinars, I always just reread the title, whatever title I made up for that day, and say, you guys read this title that says what it says. Why did you click that register and come? And then people throw in their responses.
Very cool. And so again, I know time was short, but did and I know there were a number of kind of common responses to the exact question. Did any of the responses kind of lend themselves to any insight as to why we're seeing these difficulties with policing and their interactions, particularly their interactions with communities of color and things like that? Were you able to gain any point of view from their perspective?
Not specifically to that, because we didn't pose that question. And
yeah, I know that was not the purpose of it, but I'm just trying to think, so yeah.
Yeah. And I would say this was more of a first step to open up conversations like that. And I compare it to when we first start with clients and start kind of doing a pairing process, and we don't go in with big demands. We don't start asking them to do hard things, and having conversations like this is hard. And so if we just start this process and meet everybody where they are, right? Where I am in my comfort level and where Elena was in her comfort level and the officers and things like that. And then start a process that hopefully opens up for more conversations like that.
Yeah. So you certainly don't want to go in there. And especially as someone who, as essentially a lay person with respect to law enforcement.
Exactly. Yeah.
Comes and let me tell you guys how it is. That's right. One way to get kind of laughed out of the room or thrown out of the room, depending on how that goes down, for sure. So,
and I think that may be why we were received quickly and without too much resistance, because we didn't say, hey, we're here to fix your problem. You have a problem. We know what to do. Because I'm not the expert in any environment that I go into ever, whether it's law enforcement or group home or a family home. I'm not the expert there at all. Everybody else that's been there for much longer than I have is the expert. So I can't go in and tell people what to do. They don't listen.
Yeah. So, boy, that's a real humble approach, and it sounds like certainly it's something to be modeled. So, so again, I'm glad that you're being invited back to continue to work with folks, and hopefully your inroads with the chief will give you some opportunity to further this training with folks who already got the initial, I guess, dose of it.
Yeah, that's definitely, that is on my dream list. So hopefully it might happen.
Are you aware of any other, kind of ACT Matrix folks working in the law, trying to do this kind of outreach work?
No, I'm not. I'd love to hook up with others if there are any.
All right. Well, we'll make sure people know where to find you if that's the case. So, all right. Very cool. So, as we kind of come to the close here, I want to ask you, so there's probably lots of, I know we talked about this in broad strokes, but is there anything more specific that you'd like to mention? If there are other behavior analysts listening to this who say, I really want to get involved. I really want to start making a difference. How can we use our science to, work with others to reduce and this kind of tension that's out there and whatnot between the law enforcement community and everyone else, I guess. What advice would you have for them?
Yeah, can I? You brought up tension in conversations, and I think I forgot to mention, or I want to mention that So ACT is designed to increase psychological flexibility and through those 6 processes. And so when we do one loop around the ACT matrix kind of individually or talk about humans in general, we're looking to increase that psychological flexibility. And we always start there. So we started with one loop around with the officers that we were working with. And that gets people flexible because you talk more about just humans in general, right? It's not what do you do or what should you do or things like that. And then when we do a shared purpose, we call it the pro-social matrix, and that's designed to increase psychological safety. So a lot of times when you say things like tension and these conversations are hard, or there's barriers between this group of people and this group of people, with the pro-social matrix, we're looking to set up for psychological safety so that there is a safe place to have those conversations. And what I would say to other behavior analysts who kind of want to work in their community and make things better is to just do it. If you have a process that you think is going to work and you think that somebody might benefit from it, just start asking people if you can do it, and use common language. We're taught that we need to think like behavior analysts, but speak like people. So really practice that, become fluent at going into any environment, any situation, and having a conversation with people as opposed to telling them what you know. Don't be the experts. I'm not an expert when I go into a classroom or a building or a program or anything. I'm not the expert. And just look for processes that get a conversation started and creates that safe space for people to have the conversations.
Great. And I just have to commend you on that spirit of humility, especially going into some of those settings in which, most behavior analysts are not going to have any level of expertise in it. So, all right. Thank you so much. Where can people reach you? I know you have a website. You want to mention that here, and we can certainly put that in the show notes as well. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who are like, hey, how do I do this? And they might want to hunt you down. I don't want you to give your email address out on the podcast lest your inbox get blown up, but certainly you can. It's really
easy to get in touch with me. My website is nvinstruction.com for Northern Virginia. It's Northern Virginia Instructional Consulting. So nvinstruction.com. And on there, you can schedule an appointment to talk to me. I've got like a free phone consultation button because I really am that passionate about getting this process out there and helping anyone who wants help in behavior analysis or, pizza recipes. So you can schedule an appointment there. I did start a Facebook group. It's called Clinicians Using the ACT Matrix. It was initially behavior analysts, but I've had other, occupational therapists and speech pathologists reach out, And I actually did a webinar with one to talk about flexible collaboration with other professions. And so that's facebook.com/groups/getflexible.
I see. And again, if you're walking the dog or driving your car or any of those things, I'll have that link in the show notes for sure.
Yeah.
So
And then I do free webinars every week, usually Thursdays at 11. This week I did 2. So I did one today at 11, and Thursday I'll do another one at 11 Eastern time on a platform called Crowdcast, which is really cool. Those are free. They're interactive. They're always recorded. So it's crowdcast.io/Tina Long.
All right. Well, we just traveled through space and time and fast forward a few months. So, Tina, it's great to see you again. And we're bringing in someone else to add to the conversation, Officer Joe Schlenz of the Fairfax County Police Department. Officer Joe, thanks for joining us for this segment of the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Joe, I've got a billion questions for you, but before we get to that, I just want to give Tina an opportunity to kind of catch us up on some of the stuff that she's been about since the earlier segment. Because the last time we talked, Tina, of course, was in either at late August or early September. So, if you can start by just giving us a rundown of what you've been up to then with regard to this aspect of your work, that would be a great place to kick us off with.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having us back again. And thanks, Officer Joe, for agreeing to join this. So, Matt, the last time we talked, Elena, my colleague, and I had finished doing one round of the Matrix training with the Fairfax County Police Department Crisis Intervention Team training. And we had been invited back for September. So that's when Matt and I recapped and talked a little bit about how that went and what the reactions from the class was. And so since then, we did another September round at a big church auditorium. And that was another class. And unfortunately, the October class that we were invited to was canceled because the building had some issues. And now our November class was supposed to be.
Please, what? Can you please share what the issues were? Because I just think that's,
I don't know.
We need a little comic relief in 2020.
So
I don't know if it was public. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
But I would, but I don't know if it was acknowledged. And because of the very gracious nature of the facility that was hosting us, I don't want to put them in.
All right.
But I will say that think 2020, and it's like you can't make this stuff up.
Yes,
so
exactly. Yeah.
Not to hold everybody in suspense, but
I know. So then today, right now, actually, we would be there conducting the training, but it was canceled because our COVID numbers in Virginia have started to increase. And so it sounds like either the building or our governor or something has.
Yeah, it was purely with the governor's order of restricting gatherings of 25 or more. And our classes are very large. So unfortunately it couldn't happen right now. So we're monitoring for next month though.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll find a space that we can do that. And I feel like, Joe, I could put you on the spot. I feel like Elena and I kind of have an open invitation to continue coming back and providing this piece of the week-long training. So that's really cool. Since we didn't get to come in October, Joe actually joined me on one of the webinars that I do. I do a weekly webinar. And so you were with us a couple weeks ago, so that folks who joined that, and we did the ACT Matrix, we ran through it. We talked about how to collaborate with other organizations, one of those being law enforcement organizations. And so, Matt, when you checked in with me and said, do you have anything more to report before I publish our first one? And I thought, well, let's just ask Joe if he'll join us for a conversation.
I'm so glad you did.
Yeah, he's one of the most accommodating and collaborative professionals I've met. So I figured he would say yes. Yeah.
So on that note, Joe, I know that you're the lead instructor of the crisis intervention training for the department. And
that's right.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that role is and what types of things you do in that capacity?
Sure. So crisis intervention training has been around for a couple decades. The training that we implement in our department has been around, again, for those 3 decades. It first started in Memphis, Tennessee, and pioneered by the San Antonio Police Department. And essentially there, in that model, it's a collaborative effort between a community services board, so clinicians and other community groups working toward a common goal, which in this case, crisis intervention in a nutshell, is designed to educate and prepare law enforcement officers with recognizing the signs and symptoms of mental illness or mental health crisis. Ironically enough, Virginia first started incorporating crisis intervention teams throughout the Commonwealth back during Craig Deeds. If you remember that incident, to clarify, Craig Deeds had personal experience with mental illness with his son. And because of some of the laws or some of the lack of resources during that event, which culminated in an act of violence toward him from his son, that the legislation developed and mandated crisis intervention teams be created throughout the Commonwealth. So when that was done, a handful of state instructors were blessed, quote unquote, with training other law enforcement agencies throughout the state. And it was pioneered down the New River Valley, primarily down in Southern Virginia, Roanoke, Norfolk, Albemarle County. Albemarle County, which is Charlottesville area, are our godfathers in crisis intervention as far as Fairfax County goes. That being said, we have a very strong coalition in the Northern Virginia area. To give you demographics, we have Arlington, Alexandria City, Loudoun County, Prince William, which surrounds Fairfax County. And Fairfax County began this Memphis model back in 2015. And since that time, we have continued. And during our current chief's tenure, wanted 100% of CIT trained officers. So that's been my primary job for the last couple of years since I've been assigned to the crisis intervention team. To clarify a little bit as far as the makeup of our own crisis intervention team with Fairfax County, we are the only 24/7 crisis intervention team in Virginia at this point. I know Prince William and Loudoun County have units that are at their community services board, so at their emergency mental health assessment centers during some hours, but not 24/7. What also makes us unique in Fairfax County is that we're partnered with our Fairfax County Sheriff's Office. So when I was actually taking cases over at Merrifield, which is our emergency mental health evaluation center, we are partnered with a sheriff's deputy. So our primary objective was the safety and security of that building, is the safety and security of that building, as well as the transfer of custody of individuals that are brought in for a mental health evaluation from a patrol officer. And we cater to multiple jurisdictions within Fairfax County, to include George Mason Police and some of our local town jurisdictions and the state police as well. So we train those other agencies as well. But in addition to that, because of our coalition, we help train Loudoun, Prince William, and help each other. And the curriculum in the state of Virginia is very, very structured. So your Monday through Friday curriculum is nearly identical no matter where you go, anywhere in the state. So you have your introduction class. We have an auditory hallucinations block, which we have the students put on headsets and have audio simulations play during about a 45-minute period with the students actually trying to complete simple tasks such as filling out a McDonald's application, a word finder puzzle, reading comprehension, to kind of, have for a brief period of time what that experience would be like. That's mandated by the state to have that. A 4-hour block on clinical states, which is a very broad overview on general psychological diagnoses, a block on intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, children and adolescents, psychotropic medications, substance abuse, suggestions, which we incorporate into our training in Fairfax County, is a block on veterans and how to deal with veterans in crisis. But the heart of the training is the practical scenarios which the students have to perform. So they advance from a beginning stage, intermediate, and advanced. And all the scenarios are real life. They all occur either in Fairfax County or somewhere in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And again, these are scenarios that Loudoun County does. So if I help out Loudoun County, I could participate as a role player or a coach or a panel member on those scenarios and know exactly what the scenario is about, so we can cooperate and help each other out.
So just to clarify, so you role play situations that have actually occurred that have been documented in the community.
Correct. So they're all, we're not using like names. It's kind of like that rough synopsis of something that actually occurred. And, we make our own specifications, but the core of it is it's all real. We're not making stuff up. And throughout the state, whether you go down south or here in Northern Virginia, we sometimes create new scenarios, and we can do that if, to kind of keep it fresh. But a lot of the heart of a lot of the scenarios they've been around for a long time, and everybody in the state uses them.
I see. And so doing that must allow officers to kind of use the same vocabulary regardless of where they go. So I could see where that would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
What?
So,
go ahead.
Now, and then in addition to that, what I have tried to do with crisis intervention is to, in some way, infiltrate the class, for lack of a better word, with the realization that law enforcement, we're in a difficult position, particularly in the current climate that we're in and the culture that we're in, where there's a lot of attention. There's always been a lot of attention. The moment I put on my uniform, I knew that there was a target on my back, both figuratively and literally, and how very important it is to realize that we are human, that we don't let things happen to us throughout our careers. And when I went through this crisis intervention class back in 2016, I realized that I've always liked to consider that I always had very strong empathy and very, very good active listening skills. But this reinforced that and made it up front, where you heard perspectives from, I always listen to people on the field, but in this class, NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, for those listening that aren't familiar with it, are big partners in our training and are integral to it, which is actually where through NAMI I met Tina and developed, and started talking about how we can incorporate ACT into crisis intervention training, because it all comes full circle. Is that for me to be empathetic towards somebody, I have to know myself to a certain extent. I have to know what my limitations are and where I fall short, and incorporate that into training. It goes back to the mindfulness that I talk about with Tina when we have our webinars or in training. I try to bring that into the crisis intervention training, as in planting seeds. The training is designed for recognizing mental illness, crisis situations. I consider it to be advanced de-escalation, and there's a lot of information in there. Besides the blocks of instruction, the practical scenarios, it's a lot of information to be crammed into a 40-hour class. But throughout that, I'm constantly encouraging the students, which again are primarily law enforcement, to know ourselves in that sense, and what is our purpose, and why do we do this? So often, if you ask an officer or anybody with a significant amount of time on, and I have 14 years on, why you got into law enforcement, I love asking new officers that. It's like, why do you want to do this? Particularly now in the current climate, and even with our academy session going on right now, this truly has to be a calling. This truly has to be something that you want to do as a profession, as a vocation. It's so much more than a job. It has to be more than a job. And at the same time, this job shouldn't define who we are, but it's kind of important to kind of find that balance, I think. And that's where I find a lot of success, where when we did the Matrix for the first time, it kind of reinforced a lot of what had been in my mind, but not in a platform where I was sharing it with other professionals, so to speak. And in addition to that, I'm also a member of our peer support program, which we also have in our agency, which I'd be happy to talk about, is precisely about that, and self-care and awareness and training and, vicarious trauma. And these are all things that I'm trying to sponge up to, help ourselves. Because one thing that is said in one of our de-escalation blocks, and this is from a Force Science Institute training, is that we can't de-escalate others if we can't de-escalate ourselves. And if I arrive on scene to a call and I'm already amped up, or I'm not well, so to speak, like there's something off in me, whether it's my personal life or, I'm tired, or, my kids have been, on my nerves, or a colleague, it's so important to be aware of those things in those situations, because we have such a burden to bear to begin with. It's interesting if you look at it objectively and look at law enforcement, wearing the uniform, the badge, and the stigma that really comes with that. Because in CIT, we talk about the stigma of mental illness, but I encourage the students in the class, what about the stigma of law enforcement? What about the stigma of me being a law enforcement officer that struggles with anxiety or depression or suicidal thoughts, if that's the case, and the stigma that's attached to that? It's like double stigma, so to speak. But I think it's so important to lay it all on the table in the class. And again, it's any opportunity I get to kind of plant those seeds is what I love doing. And that's where I think that the ACT exercise really comes into play.
Do you find that, it sounds like this training gave you, kind of some words to describe what you already kind of approached the job with. That sounds like a kind of like an aha moment. It's like, oh, this is kind of, like gives language to some of these things that I've, approached the job with. But do you feel that this material is sometimes a harder sell with other people who are going through this training? I don't want to make stereotypes here, but if there's, folks who are less attuned to this or might think this is, very touchy feely, and I'm, here to, might have more of a black and white, point of view on right and wrong. And, I'm here to, enforce the law, yada, yada, yada. And again, I don't want to make stereotypes where they don't apply, but, so can you talk to me about how to try to perhaps reach some trainees that might not come to this material very easily or as easily as you did?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, for the last couple of years, that has been my burden and my joy at the same time, because I love that challenge. I love new officers. And I was a field trainer prior to this assignment. And I love that because you have a clean slate, no bad habits, showing a new officer the proper way to do things, or the way that I think is best. And, not necessarily just look at my techniques or the way I do things, but to kind of have an open mind about it. When a veteran officer, and I would consider myself to be a veteran officer at this point, but let's just say a veteran officer that is not in tune with some of these things, I love that challenge, because regardless of what your mindset is like going into a CIT class, you're going to get something out of it. I believe that, and again, this is written in the Virginia CIT state guidelines, not going against the directive that our agency wants, but, and I quote, not everybody's meant to be a SWAT officer. Much similarly, not everybody's meant to be a crisis intervention officer. And we can look at the pros and cons of that and debate that. And I see both, but I welcome that challenge for those officers that might see it as touchy-feely and, quote unquote, hug a thug things. And that's what we kind of dispel right at the beginning of the class. I'm using those exact words in the introduction class to dispel that, because I will tell you right off the bat, the other thing that we harp on throughout the class is officer safety. I would like to consider myself to be a extremely sound officer with sound tactics and safety, and always being aware of that. And that actually comes in with another phrase, again, the mindfulness, situational awareness. I think applies to every aspect of our job, to include when to use force, when not to use force, whether CIT applies. CIT does not apply to an active shooter situation, for example. Even in a crisis situation, if there's a weapon involved, it's not necessarily important for me to figure out how they got to this point. And I have to defeat my mind, because I love the psychoanalytical aspect of why is somebody acting like this. But in that moment, I have to defeat that and realize I have to focus on what's important right now to connect with that person. So when that happens in the class, and there's an officer who I can immediately tell is, students like that they're very obvious. And sometimes we get intel when it comes in, it's like, hey, so-and-so's in this class and he's not really happy to be in the class. I welcome it. And I will tell you, 98% of the time, the most, what's the word I'm looking for?
Like a reluctant learner?
Yeah, reluctant learner. But for me, the achievement for me is the change that you see from the beginning of the class to the end of the class, where they're coming out of their shell. And not to speak, obviously, the other thing I look at is perspective on everybody comes from a certain place. So I don't know what's going on in that officer's life either. I don't know if there's something that, you know, that he or she has, you know, an adversity to mental health illness, or, you know, something that is troubling, because the things that we talk about are unsettling. I mean, even during the scenarios, we preface each scenario with what you will experience might strike a chord. We've had instances in the class where if it's a suicidal subject, there might be a student in that class that recently experienced that with someone that was very close, and we are at the ready to swoop in and do what we need to do as far as peer support goes. But I consider CIT to be as nitty gritty as you can get, which is what I tell the class. This is not like, I've actually tried to Google what is touchy-feely policing, and I can't find anything, so I don't know where that came from. But that's
I like hug-a-thug.
Or hug-a-thug means, because to me, there is nothing more nitty-gritty than trying to communicate with somebody when life and death is on the line. Nothing else. So if that means that I have to, and this is actually where the training comes in, of me being empathetic to that person, treating that person like a family member. If I'm working in a jail or something like that, I'm probably not going to use my first name so much, you know? But if somebody's in crisis, using my first name is sometimes that switch to be like, this is, all right, this is a human being that's here. This is not an officer, and humanizing ourselves and showing that compassion is huge in those circumstances. And I can obviously give you a lot of anecdotal information, how I've seen that firsthand, but that is what I hope that these students in the class get. And again, it's playing those scenes, because you can't change the mindset. I can only, you know, show techniques and what you're supposed to do and have the students perform that, and they perform that satisfactorily and they've gotten the training. But really, it's something that has to change in the heart, in my opinion. But that's just me being, you know, very idealistic, because I can't make everybody me, or, you know, empathetic, or, you know, because we all come from different places and we all have different levels and skill sets. Right. This happened to be mine before I went into the class, which is why I was one of the voluntolds to go in the class when we first started up with the 2015. And I didn't necessarily, nobody wants to go to something when they're told to do it. It's like, hey, you have to do this mandatory training. So I experienced that, but I had an open mind about it, because it was something that I naturally gravitated toward anyway. An officer that doesn't, or is uncomfortable with, you know, mental health calls, this training reinforces the confidence, hands down, and gives you a sharper edge, is what I tell the students. Like, you know, you also get the officers that say, like, you know, I already know how to talk to people. I don't know, go through a class, but guaranteed it's a sharper edge. It puts in a framework, which you've already done. And again, we reinforce a lot of the mental health laws in Virginia, which if you don't do them all the time, you don't know them. And CIT is a perishable skill. I mean, you have to use it every single day.
I like that word, perishable skill.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And voluntold. Well,
voluntold, yeah. Hug-a-thug, voluntold, and a perishable skill.
That's right. We're gonna have a glossary with this episode. So I hear that using terms like hug-a-thug and whatnot is or trying to dispel the myth of touchy-feely in a vain attempt to try to find out what the actual definition of that is. That those might be some tactics, I suppose, to reach that, right? Officer who's not psyched to be there. Are there other ways that you found successful to reach them? Because you said that it's a challenge that you look forward to, if I heard you correctly, to have these types of folks in class to be able to kind of change their perspective. What are there tips for reaching folks who are reluctant in this way that you've found helpful over the years of doing this?
So something that I have thought about often, and this is both as a student in other classes, particularly in law enforcement, because, you know, we have a very interesting culture. You know, it's a job unlike any other. It has its own culture, and there's stigmas attached to it. And obviously you have media representations, cinema representations. There's a lot of allure to it and mystique, and, you know, there's so many facets to it. But really what it comes down to is just, I look at it, it's like, why are we here? What's the purpose? So immediately right off the bat, I'm thinking for that officer who's in here, he's already been voluntold to do it. He's been mandated by our agency to go through this training. He's been doing this for 20 years. He's been successfully, for the most part, communicating with people. How am I going to get through to this guy? And the first thing I think of is, again, selfishly, if I'm a student, what's in this for me? I'm a police officer. What am I going to get out of this training? Because it's all well and good when we have, our peer support specialists talking about their stories and their perspectives, and our NAMI peer support when they come in and talk about their perspective. So if I'm sitting there, it's like, what does this have to do with me? It really comes down to, what is this about me why does this bother me? So it's almost like I've actually asked a class. I don't do this all the time, but I'm pretty sure I didn't do it in August when we were at George Mason, because, tough training conditions. We're all masked up, socially distanced. And for the most part, it was actually more a very engaging group, despite all that. I was very, very pleased with that. Yeah. But in those circumstances, like, how am I going to get through to someone who is just set in their ways? And where it comes out is in the scenarios. There is a lot of surprise where you put someone in that scenario that they come out of their shell, and we actually develop the scenarios in that way to precisely for that. Say, hey, this guy is really closed off. We need to put him in something where there has to be an emotional connection to kind of bring that officer out of the shell, and that's usually where it comes out. And I've been very impressed with some of the students that have come in where they don't appear to be engaged, and when they're actually in the spot in that training environment, it comes out, and then you see it firsthand. It's like, I had no idea that existed until we put that student in that situation to see that emerge. So essentially it's like, what is this? What am I going to get out of this? Because the other thing is that we constantly harp on is officer safety throughout the class every day. I feel very confident in my level of officer safety. I might sit next to somebody, but I'm not going to sit next to them with on my gun side, for example, or I'm always having a plan B. But that doesn't take away me actively listening to somebody. So it's like, all right, and necessary aspect of the job. The law in the state of Virginia requires a law enforcement officer. We are the only ones in the state that can enact a paperless emergency custody order, which is essentially taking somebody against their, well, I don't want to say against their will, but because it's a civil order, essentially in for a emergency mental health evaluation based on that they have a mental illness and there's a substantial likelihood of a threat to themselves, others, or inability to care, or need of hospitalization, and are unwilling to seek voluntary treatment. Tina, as a reliable reporter, can relay that information to me as a law enforcement officer, but ultimately she can't do that. She can't enact a paperless ECO. She can petition to a magistrate to do that, but she has to articulate that to me. And ultimately, I'm the one that has to make that decision to do that. And a lot of officers, that's a tremendous burden. It's like, well, that needs a chance, because obviously now it's interesting with our legislation in Virginia is doing precisely that, reevaluating the law, whether or not a law enforcement officer should respond as a first responder to any mental health call. But as it is right now, I tell the officers, hey, look, guys, this is a part of our job. Why do you want to do this? And this is rhetorical, obviously, here, but in the class, I might get a response of, I want to lock up bad guys. Well, I would take that even further. Why do you want to lock up bad guys? It's just simply of locking somebody up. I think it goes deeper than that. It's you want to lock up bad guys because you have a sense of justice, or you want, you crave order, or you want that to protect other people, but it's deeper than that. So that's what I try to, get out of those students that are obstinate. And it's a challenge. And I really enjoy that aspect of it, though, because it is very gratifying was the word I was looking for.
I see.
It was from the whole class, Yeah.
It was very gratifying to see that emerge through the week of the class.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/getCEs. This is fascinating. I'm wondering, and again, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but are there any statistics in terms of like complaints from the community or anything like that that you can maybe, and it might be a little bit of tea leaf reading or something like that, but do you feel, is there either objective or subjective evidence to suggest that these efforts that you're making with the trainings that you're doing is leading to an improvement in kind of officer community relations and things like that?
Absolutely. So I would answer it in two ways. One, anecdotally, for me being assigned at Merrifield, I can give you many, many instances where I've interacted with someone who was either voluntary initially or then had to become involuntary, an officer bringing in an individual that on an involuntary basis, simply by taking that moment, wearing full badge of authority, uniform, and explaining the process, explaining where they are, that the reassurance of I'm here to help you, all of these things, and countless hours spent together at our hospital. And I don't know how it is in New Hampshire, but Virginia, we have a terrible bed crisis in the state for psychiatric beds. And we spend now, and this is very unfortunate, and I will tout this to any public citizen group saying that it's very unfortunate, but we are spending between 16 to 20 hours in an emergency room with an individual in crisis. And we do see the decompensation, and we work very, very hard to stabilize and communicate. And sometimes in those circumstances, things happen and injuries happen, whether it involves me or an individual at the hospital. But even despite all that, if that happens, we're back in the quote unquote fight, so to speak, and we still continue the communication. We still talk about the process. We're in this together. I'm here to help you because it's a civil war. You haven't done anything wrong. That was one of the huge things where doing this every single day, obviously, to serve and protect is a huge part of our job. And that encompasses so many things. But so often for me, speaking personally, arresting someone, just because I arrest somebody, just because I put handcuffs on somebody does not mean that I can't use CIT. It does not mean that if someone's a criminal versus mental health, because, I like to operate in that gray area. Like if someone is having a crisis after they're arrested, what's wrong with me explaining the process? Here's what's going to happen. Even in our job, if I'm an officer who has gone through a critical incident and I'm a peer support member, I'm going to let that officer know, here's what's going to happen. This is who's going to interview you. This is what's going to happen. We're going to go here and we're going to go there. I do the exact same thing with someone experiencing a mental health crisis. So as far as the feedback goes in the community, and again, I'm biased when I say that Fairfax County has a very strong public affairs bureau, and a lot of the information is actually advertised. And our chief obviously is a big proponent of it, as well as our sheriff. And there's a lot of awareness that I've spoken to a lot of community groups and student social worker groups at George Mason and citizen advisory councils and our civilian review panel, and explain CIT. So often we see complainants calling and saying they are requesting a CIT trained officer. At school, social workers are asking for a CIT officer. Our school resource officers in Fairfax County have all gone through our CIT class and have all gotten the training. So I feel like there's a lot of positive attention on it. But speaking from a grassroots level, or rather a fundamental level of the success we've seen, I can tell you firsthand that so this is interesting. Statistically speaking, we are handling more cases, and the beds are making it very, very difficult for us to limit the amount of contact we have on somebody. So in those circumstances, there are a rise of injuries involving either officers or some consumers, mainly because of that time delay. Very rarely on the front end, but I am happy to say that even statistically speaking, we are at 1% probably of officer-related injuries with the thousands of cases that we've had. And I believe that is attributed to the training that we've had. And again, I could tell you many cases where I've had the ability to do that almost every day at Merrifield, where it could have been a use of force situation when it didn't have to be, simply by taking the time. Things change, though. I also like to throw the county argument in, is that CIT is not the magic blanket where you can just throw it on somebody and everything's going to be good, because we have to assess what's happening right now. But that's the perishable skill. That's the tool that if you don't use it, you might lose it. And that's the resource that you have. It's like, does CIT apply in this situation?
Yeah,
and I've seen a lot of success with it.
And Matt, can I tie this into
Please.
a little bit of what I do and how I learned about CIT and how it might apply to more of the behavior analysts listening, because we work a lot in the intellectual and developmental disabilities world. And many of my clients are adults who live in group homes, and they escalate in a way that could look like a mental health crisis, but many of them don't have any, clinically significant psychiatric conditions. But what happens is people call the police. Parents have called police on their children or adolescents. And what we've been able to do is instruct all of the parents that we work with. And this is where Elena and I kind of hooked up and said, maybe the CIT class is our way to approach the entire, county and the law enforcement. We instruct them to ask for a CIT officer. We instruct all group homes, ask for a CIT officer, day support. If you think you need to call the police in this situation, ask for a CIT officer. Because Joe talks a lot about, mental illness and the trainings in those areas. But when an individual with a disability is escalating and they don't have language, and people are afraid and they don't want to call 911, but that's who is in their toolbox to call. And I've had clients who, have no language, and they are escalating, and they are big people, and they are strong people, and they get put in handcuffs and taken away. And to know that we can have officers who are trained with a little bit more of the de-escalation and a little bit more of the perspective taking. That's where we in Fairfax County rely on the CIT officers a lot. And many of my clients with disabilities also have coexisting, clinically significant mental health things going on as well. But when it's, just a big guy with an intellectual disability who doesn't have language and he's destroying his house, and the group home wants to call 911, knowing that CIT officers will respond and maybe de-escalate things a little bit more. And even if they do end up still taking him to Merrifield and emergency services, knowing that the CIT officers are there, and it might not escalate to something that's detrimental. Because people,
I was curious, as both you guys are talking here, I'm wondering, what percent of officers in Fairfax are CIT trained?
So as of right now, and again, the state model, and that's the Virginia CIT state guidelines, suggests 25% trained. So those are your volunteer. That's the volunteer specialist model. That's not everybody's meant to be a SWAT operator, and that's just the state's guidelines. And again, I see pros and cons to that. But for Fairfax County, again, our chief wants 100% trained, and we are roughly at 47%. So you are getting 24/7 coverage as far as a CIT officer out in the field, unless the two CIT officers that are on each squad are actually on another event. Very likely you're going to get someone who's gone through the class. And obviously I can't speak on behalf of the smaller jurisdictions such as our town of Vienna, town of Herndon, but they are very close to 100% because of their size. But as far as our agency goes, we're halfway there. But I'll also say, just to kind of tout what I'm doing now and currently in expectation of next year, barring I believe that we'll still be dealing with the pandemic, but
2020 notwithstanding.
The rosters for 2021 are getting full. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, this year was our year to get everybody trained. We had large classes that were at large facilities. A typical size of a CIT class is between 20 and 25. We doubled it. And we were able to achieve that during a pandemic at George Mason using the large auditorium and masked and socially distanced, and had a lot of success with it despite that. And we've had two of those. I missed the McLean or the second training at the church. But because of that, we are doing our best effort. But by the end of this year, we were looking to be ready to go. Like, we would probably only have a couple hundred by the beginning of 2021 to train, if not for this pandemic. So it was a lot of hardship this year in many, many ways. And then with this class being canceled this week, yet again, it was kind of like one of those things where, going back to my perspective, control what you can control.
Yeah.
So I think we've done a positive way by actually having being available to do this podcast when we actually would be presenting at the class.
Yeah.
Very cool. Joe, you mentioned something earlier. I want to circle back to, I think you used the term vicarious trauma as it relates to officers and, self-care. And there's a couple other terms that are kind of in the same category that you used. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that works? What sort of supports are available, and to help officers manage stress, to manage those things so that they are, as close to their best as possible when they're out there in the field, and people are depending on them to, not only support them but also to exercise good judgment and decision making and things like that.
Absolutely. And there's actually some media, some News 4 in DC pieces that our chief has spoken firsthand. From a couple years ago, we had a roll call video that our chief put together about suicide prevention intervention that was played at every roll call. And it was a tough watch. I remember being in my old squad and watching that video and actually hearing firsthand from the officers in that. Some of the officers and firefighters that are represented in that news piece and in that video have spoken at the CIT class, and I consider to be integral parts of the class, and very gracious to talk about their experiences with suicide. And obviously our chief is very transparent about that and has spoken openly about that. And because of that, CIT is first and foremost on his mind, as well as our peer support program. So to give you an idea of where Fairfax County's peer support program is, it falls under the Incident Support Bureau, which under that umbrella, you have your peer support team, a group of police psychologists, EAP, chaplains, police chaplains, so either incorporate any religion such as Jewish faith, Catholic, evangelical, and that is in place. And as being a member of that team, we ourselves go through mandatory training, but it's important for us to relay that message to other officers. We also have a program that, and I believe there's a news piece for this too, we have emotional therapy dogs that can be deployed out if need be. But more often than that, a lot of the attention is brought to us as far as that vicarious trauma that we go through, and how the things that we've seen and dealt with through our years in law enforcement, they accumulate. I find it interesting and I don't think I've ever fallen into this, but in any grisly scene that I've ever been on, I've always had that awareness that this is messed up. This is not normal. This is disturbing. But very often, sometimes we will use as coping mechanisms, macabre humor and things like that to kind of make sense out of all these things. And I can have a very macabre sense of humor, very dark sense of humor, but I still realize that this is not normal. And that recognition, I think, is so important. And with our peer support, I will lay it on the table and talk to anybody about it. And one of our clinicians that does the block on suicide prevention and intervention shows that news piece to the class, which most people remember. And again, you can YouTube it to see, the video firsthand, but it's so important to realize what the statistics are. And a lot of people don't know this, but the number one killer in law enforcement is suicide.
Wow.
You'll often think about, that it's, police-involved shootings and cruiser crashes, which are very high, but police suicides are the most high and are probably underreported because of the stigma attached to it. And our chief has really worked hard at putting that spotlight on that issue and talking about it, and simply talking about it in any outlet, whether it's CIT class or through our peer support training or vicarious trauma training that I might have the opportunity to go through. I will use it and talk about it. The presenters that talk in our veterans block, some of them have law enforcement backgrounds, some of them have PTSD and have experienced trauma either on a personal level and that coexisting with the PTSD that they experience in combat, openly talk about it. I mean, it's really like a gut punch to the class when you hear a veteran just bearing their soul and saying, like, I've experienced these things and the stigma has to stop. The law enforcement suicides have to stop. And again, you have that officer in there who maybe on Monday didn't want to hear it, and then on Friday it's like that gut punch where you're like, man, this is the real deal, that nobody is impervious to that. Nobody. I so often think about, and I'm stealing something from one of our clinicians, that what would it take for me to be in that crisis mode where I'm detained on an involuntary detention, and we are a moment away from experiencing something where we could be in that critical incident where my world has ended. And I think it's important to realize that in that class to put the spotlight on it. And that really comes back to, why are we doing this, and what's our purpose in life, and what's important to us? Because so often we kind of look at it, we try to look at it from a distance. Like if I'm on a suicide call or a homicide or something like that, from a scientific standpoint, I can look at, well, what happened here? But it's still human beings involved. And if you kind of like let yourself go down that rabbit hole, you're like, well, now this is really messed up, but it's still affecting you, in other words. And that's what I think is so hard, because we have all these walls where I'm trained to not feel things, or I'm trained to act a certain way, or I can't let this happen because I need to, it's tough. It's really tough to be in that situation constantly where nobody was meant to see the things that we see and expect, that everything's going to be okay, that things aren't going to bubble to the surface. So I think that's where the peer support program comes in. I think we have a very strong program.
What, in either, kind of recruit training or ongoing professional development, do you guys practice like tapping people out if, like if two officers are on a call and one's getting overly emotionally involved or, getting worked up and is not being effective and things like that? I'm thinking, and is either already doing something or is about to do something that is, outside of the bounds of propriety or protocol, right, or what have you. I often, I know in behavior analysis, when we are, we're oftentimes in the business of supporting individuals who can be wildly unsafe and things like that. And a lot of the safety protocols, have that, kind of a safety valve built in where you practice saying, hey, I got this, take a break, and things like that. And that, because it's practiced, or ideally practiced, it's normalized. So it's not like a threat to your, it's not like a perceived threat to your competence or anything like that. Right. It's just, I've done this a bunch of times in training, so I know that this is what the deal is. Do you guys do stuff like that?
Absolutely. I can't speak on behalf of what our recruits go through, since it's been a long time since I've been through the academy and kind of see what their level of de-escalation is. But as far as CIT training, that is a specific block of instruction that in our de-escalation block about switching out personnel, not taking things personally. And really it comes down to, everybody's got strengths and weaknesses, but for whatever reason, and I can tell you this from personal experience, there was some individuals that I was dealing with, that I was interacting with, that was having a mental health crisis. And as soon as I walked into the room, turned their back to me and just gave me a really bad stare, didn't want to talk to me. So I'm like, I'm not going to be able to communicate with this person if I don't exist in their mind. So I'm like, how do I exist? But I might look like somebody that traumatized that person at some point. I don't know. But in our training, it's like, there is no shame in switching out personnel. If somebody wants to talk to another officer simply because of their ethnicity or the way that they look, why not? If that is available. Now, granted, that occasion doesn't always happen. Like sometimes what you get what you're dealt. but having that awareness, absolutely, that is a part of our training as far as CIT goes, and switching out personnel, knowing our limitations, has nothing to do with having like a weakness. This is like, I'm tapping out. Like there was a couple cases at the hospital where I was worn out by an individual's behavior where it was like, I need to take 5 minutes and step out. And my partner would come in and sit there and, we're back in the game. But absolutely, that's a part of the training.
Okay, nice. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate it. What I'd like to do is perhaps just close this segment of the show with maybe your advice, Joe, for I think, again, let me just back up a second. I think Tina, particularly in the early segment, that you didn't get a chance to hear yet, it's just a great example of a behavior analyst, who has this knowledge of, and her own perspective on what makes people tick, reaching out to local law enforcement to see what, what our profession can do to help. So I guess what I'd like to do is get your perspective in terms of what advice would you have for other folks in our profession in terms of reaching out to police departments all over the place. I'm hoping that by hearing this, other behavior analysts are inspired to, reach out to their local PDs. And there's probably a way to do it, and there's probably a way not to do it. So, if you could share whatever insight you might have on that, that would be, I think, a great place to round out the show.
So, again, looking at perspective, I think there's a lot of strong CIT programs throughout the country. I know that for a fact. CIT International is a good website to check out, to look for those programs, because there's a tremendous amount of resources right there where the conversation has already started. But if it's a one-on-one kind of interaction, and I was actually talking with some of my colleagues earlier about this, because so often, particularly with the media representation today and the narrative that is being presented, whether it's positive or negative, these conversations, I believe, do need to happen. But we constantly talk about, well, not constantly, but I talk about bias and empathy and why people act the way they do, and everybody has a perspective. I think if you're not in law enforcement, I think it's very important to realize, tell me about your world and what is it, where are you coming from? Because that's what I would do for you all, for example. Like, I want to know how to communicate effectively with an individual with a developmental disability, or what are some good techniques to communicate with someone with a borderline personality disorder, and how can I do that and speak that language and try to find that common ground. For law enforcement, it's like, and obviously this would take a great length of time to explain, but those split-second decisions that an officer has to make, and the burden of being a law enforcement professional, being held to a higher standard, the perception that some of the media have and some people have, and quite frankly, some individuals that have had negative experiences with law enforcement. It's like, how can we dispel that? So it's like, tell me about your world and tell me how I can communicate, because I can tell you that our clinicians that are involved in our class, they want to be involved in the class because the clients that they are serving, they don't want them to get hurt. They don't want them to be put in a situation where they're traumatized even further, or have to go through those circumstances and look at it from that perspective. It's like, you don't want anything bad to happen. You don't want people to get hurt, whether it's law enforcement or your clients. But from a clinical perspective, look at it. I would encourage individuals to look at it from that perspective, that I'm going to reach out, even if I don't understand every facet of law enforcement, because I want to know what's best for the people that I serve, and that we can work together, because ultimately we're working toward the same goal. Like, I think it's interesting how the conversation has now shifted toward maybe law enforcement responding to mental health calls for the last four decades. Maybe that wasn't a good idea. Maybe we have to reevaluate and look at this, but that's just the way it's been. It's like, when something strange, quote unquote, is happening, or it's not understood, or someone's acting disorderly and they have a mental illness, we could talk history and think about, deinstitutionalization and everything, but we're the first responders there. So finding that common ground and again, looking at that purpose, like, why are we doing this? Like, even in the clinical profession, it's like, why do you help the individuals that you do? And when they're experiencing a crisis and when they're acting violently, it's like, who do you call? Law enforcement, and try to, bridge that gap. And I will say in Fairfax County, I think we do a really good job with that. I mean, there's a couple, issues here and there but the conversation is happening. And I think that's a huge step, just simply talking about it, like even informally, like taking the time, like I will take any opportunity to talk to somebody like in the lobby, wherever I'm at, and tell me about your perspective. You see me and like, how does that make you feel? So I think to kind of counter that from a clinical perspective, ask a law enforcement officer, like, what is that like when you have to go to those? So that must be really, really difficult to have to deal with that constantly. And our police psychologists, they tap into that obviously because they're in our world, but it's kind of like, ask about it.
I see.
That's what I would suggest. I'm
going to go out on a limb and probably guess that you've been told you'd make a very good therapist.
Yes, I have. And interestingly enough, I did not have a lot of schooling on that, but I did get my degree in mental health.
All right.
However, I will also I would also say that with, ironically, I wanted to be a police officer since I was a little kid, but I never gave it any thought through my, adolescence and, up until the last year of college where I kind of wanted to go into more cerebral aspects of law enforcement, like FBI, the profiler program, which
me too. That's my dream.
So that was, Silence of the Lambs,
Criminal Minds. Yeah.
Yes, Mindhunter. That was my thing. But I had no idea how much I loved putting on the uniform and being that community caretaker kind of aspect, the guardian, so to speak. I can fight if I need to, but I've always, on a tangent, I'm trying to tap into that guardian mindset is what I'm trying to figure out where I can go with that, because that's where I've always been and from the very beginning.
Yeah.
All right. Very cool. Well, it's a great note to end on. Tina Long, Joseph Schlenz, thanks for joining me for this part 2, which is oddly enough in the same episode. So, all right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.